Stalingrad, September 1942. The situation in the city was dire, and major changes would be needed for the Soviets to avoid a full rout. They had held the vital river crossings across the Volga, and now reinforcements were pouring in. But the German onslaught continued. But it was time for Soviet commanders to plan a major counterattack. This is the turning point. The Soviets were about to strike back. The situation around Stalingrad changed somewhat, with new commanders placed in charge of the new separate sides of Stalingrad. One named the Don Front, which was the northwest of the city, the other the Stalingrad Front, which was the southeast of the city. The Don Front getting a large amount of reinforcements, specifically 7 new rifle divisions and multiple smaller forces, which would soon be used as the Soviets were gearing up for their third of the Kulturban offensives. The Soviets still wanted to break the German flanks outside the city. They were sure they could hold the main city itself, as the urban fighting for Stalingrad was so brutal. To retake the city through a street-to-street battle would be too costly. A good decision, in my opinion, by the Soviets, and something the German forces failed to anticipate. They should have covered their flanks better and thought more about outside of Stalingrad, not just the inner workings of the city. The fighting in the city was still raging on though, and the Germans were far from done. As early October came, their sights were set on the main industrial prizes of Stalingrad: the Red October steel factory, the Barricade arms factory, and the Stalingrad tractor factory, which was now in play. These industrial prizes had been turned into fortresses rivaling the mighty of Soviet military infrastructure, and large amounts of Soviet troops were entwined, ready to repel the invader. To make the Germans' advance even more rough, the Russians had become experts in urban camouflage, making it almost impossible to locate the enemy until they were firing at you. This caused extreme caution in the advancing troops, and casualties were beginning to become unbearable for the Germans, but they still had to advance. Their only chance was to retake Stalingrad quickly now, because they knew if it took any longer, the Russian winter would eventually set in, and they were ill prepared for it, as we now know. The tactics of urban warfare has also improved massively, with both sides now using large amounts of snipers, with the Soviets becoming particularly adept at this, with sniper aces such as the great Vasily Zaitsev, who slew many a German, and his use in propaganda was a massive boon to the troops. And with large amounts of NCOs and officers being picked off by snipers, it made good quality leadership short on supply, which definitely impacted the soldiers. The Soviets also laid numerous booby traps and IEDs, knowing the Germans were ferocious in the assault and would push them back to a point. This granted casualties and morale loss on the Germans, and now they could not trust anything in the city, as suddenly the wrong step may cause an explosion. A soldier's nightmare, and the average German in the city must have been on the verge of breaking mentally. It was horrific for them, and the Russians knew that if they could break the spirit, then they could break them physically. As October began, the Germans began their assault on the industrial areas. It was hard going, but the Germans' use of combined arms did push the Russians back and inflict heavy casualties. The Soviets' 37th Rifles were broken and beaten back beyond the tractor factory, and the 62nd Army was actually split at points because of the attacks, causing great concern. This pushed the commanders to commit many reserves to keep the Germans from a full breakthrough, and as if pushed all the way back to the Volga, it would be almost impossible to retake the city. Some of the fighting actually happened inside the Barricade gun factory, with troops using industrial machinery for cover and the more risk-averse soldiers climbing gantries and pipeworks to get above their enemies in death-defying attacks. And throughout October, the Soviets repelled the Germans, even though at times they were down to a thin strip of land on the edges of the city, parallel to the Volga. But the Germans just could not dislodge the Soviets, but the price to hold was paid in lives. The industrial sector was important, too important to fall, and it had to resist the invader no matter what. Comrade Stalin would not allow the men to retreat. At points in the battle for Stalingrad, the Soviet need for armour became desperate, and the tractor factory, which was now converted to T-34 production, went into overdrive. With it being rumoured fresh tanks off the line were driven straight into combat, with some only having basic components, lacking any size, meaning the crews had to fire almost point blank to have any hope of hitting the enemy. An absolutely crazy endeavour, but when duty calls, the Soviet soldier arose to the occasion, and the bravery and ferocity were at a peak of anything ever seen before, I think. And as the fighting through October raged in the city, the Germans captured more territory, and estimated between 70 and 90% of the city was under German control. But personally, large amounts were still contested, with Soviets and German troops interwoven throughout the city. It was chaos, and no side could truly declare they had the city. The battle would have to claim hundreds of thousands more lives until that day would come. As combat continued in the city, the third Kulturban offensive launched in early October, just after the end of the second. There was little time for preparation and for the rest of the troops, and they were extremely exhausted. The Guard troops were not ready for another combat. This was a massive blunder by Soviet leadership, but with the dire situation in the city, relief had to come in any form available. The attack had little to no success apart from keeping the pressure on the flanks of the Sixth Army. This pleased Soviet commanders in the sense that it held German forces from supporting inside the city combat, but at the same time, a massive loss of troops and armour was then wasted on this offensive. It would have been far better to build up, but, as I said, the situation was dire, and the Soviet commanders were clutching at any straw they could get. Then, the fourth Kulturplan offensive was a direct response to the Germans seizing much of the industrial territory in Stalingrad. They knew the 62nd Army was close to breaking, and Stalin himself ordered the German flanks must be broken. So it fell on the Don front to the northwest side of the city to launch this large attack with fresh troops and armoured support. It would be a major assault. But once again, due to panic and desperation, they were given little time to prepare, and the fact they were assaulting two German mechanised divisions backed up by a panzer division, who were heavily entrenched, this would make it extremely difficult for the Soviets. The offensive did to the north have some help from the southeast, who would also launch a parallel smaller assault to try and divert some of the German Sixth Army's attention, but the flanks had tens of thousands of men and armoured vehicles, and the lines would not be broken easily. The German combined armed tactics were so good, and the rush preparations let the Soviets down, they were easily pushed back, and after a few days the offensive petered out. They had lost men and machines that were very vital to them, and they had achieved once again nothing. Whilst the city of Stalingrad almost seemed lost, but had the complete focus of the Germans, their allies, who were relegated to second line and defensive duties, were almost forgotten by German high command, and they lacked sufficient support and woefully unprepared for major combat. The Soviets saw this and now had a plan to break the Germans by pushing them on their weak areas of the front and cut the supply lines. Now began preparation for the winter campaign. The Soviets were to use the brutal Russian winter to their advantage and storm the unprepared German allies. This was to be a big shock, and soon a major Soviet offensive, codenamed Operation Uranus, would begin. Operation Uranus was to launch originally on the 9th, but the Soviet Marshal Zhukov, after visiting the line and seeing the poor state of organisation and the troops, ordered a 1-week delay to get things in shape. There could be no room for blunders on such a large-scale plan. The main thrust of the operation would be to go around the battle-hardened and veteran German forces at Stalingrad and strike at the weak Allied forces comprising mainly of Romanian troops. Though good soldiers, they lacked AT and armoured support and could not repel a mass Soviet force. So on the 19th, the first pincer of the encirclement began. The Romanian troops in the area actually heard the mass preparations and asked German High Command for assistance, but they were refused. The Romanians were then hit with the might of 3 full Soviet armies comprising of 18 infantry divisions, 8 tank brigades, 2 motorised brigades, 6 cavalry divisions and 1 anti-tank brigade. These forces overran the Romanians very quickly on the north of Stalingrad and punched right through their lines. And as the German forces failed to build rearguard defensive fortifications to defend the supply areas, the major breakthrough carried on very far into the territory. This was a massive problem for the Germans, and their lack of foresight was about to be punished. Then, to complete the encirclement, the day after, the second pincer pushed south of Stalingrad with 2 full armies, and they hit the Romanians defending here. Once again they were overrun, but they did put up a better fight than the northern Romanian forces. But still the flanks were gone, and both attacking forces raced towards the town of Kalach, and they met on the 23rd of November, and the encirclement was then complete. Ironically, this is the tactic the Germans used to a very great effect on the Russians. It had now been used against them. They had failed to prepare for it. The Soviet cauldron was now fully in place, and the Sixth Army was surrounded. Low on winter clothing, supplies, and still fighting through the ruined hellscape of Stalingrad, this was about to get even worse for the terrible situation that the Germans were already in. I hope you enjoyed this history episode, and hopefully I will see you on the third part. Thanks for watching everyone, and you guys have a fantastic day.